The wheel wouldn't budge an inch, no matter how hard Sarah Collins pushed against it. The hot Nevada sun beat down mercilessly on her back as she strained against the heavy wooden wagon wheel that had come loose from her wagon. Sweat trickled down her face, her dress already clinging uncomfortably to her skin. She was miles from Hawthorne, with supplies that wouldn't last more than a day if she couldn't get moving again. "Come on," she muttered through gritted teeth, digging her boots into the dusty ground for leverage. The wheel merely wobbled mockingly in response. Sarah straightened up, wiping her brow with the back of her hand and surveying the desolate landscape around her. The vast emptiness of the Nevada desert stretched in every direction, punctuated only by scraggly sagebrush and the distant silhouette of mountains. Sarah was about to make another attempt when she heard the steady rhythm of hoofbeats approaching. Shielding her eyes from the sun, she made out the figure of a rider coming toward her. A mixture of relief and caution washed over her. Help was welcome, but strangers in these parts weren't always friendly. The man slowed his horse as he approached, and Sarah could now see he was tall and broad-shouldered, with a weathered face partially hidden beneath the brim of his hat. His clothes were dusty from the trail, but the gun at his hip looked well-maintained. "Afternoon, madam," he called out, tipping his hat. "Looks like you're having some trouble." Sarah nodded, pushing a strand of auburn hair from her face. "Wheel came off about an hour ago. I've been trying to lift it back into place." Without another word, the man dismounted, tying his horse to a nearby shrub before walking over to examine the wagon. He knelt down, inspecting the wheel and axle with practiced eyes. "Name's Dustin Young," he said, standing up and dusting off his hands. "I can help you get this fixed." "Sarah Collins," she replied. "I'd be much obliged." Dustin positioned himself beside the wheel, lifting it with a grunt while Sarah guided it toward the axle. Together, they managed to slide it into place. As he hammered the linchpin back in, securing the wheel, he glanced around the empty wagon and landscape. "Where's your husband?" he asked, his deep voice casual but curious. Sarah's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "Don't have one," she answered, her tone making it clear she didn't want to elaborate. Dustin nodded, respecting her privacy. "You're a fair way from anywhere, heading to Hawthorne." "Yes," Sarah replied, relaxing slightly. "I've got a small place just outside town." "Been to Carson City for supplies." "That's quite a journey for a woman alone," Dustin observed, though his tone carried no judgment. Sarah's green eyes flashed. "I manage just fine, Mr. Young," he smiled slightly. "I don't doubt it, but these roads can be dangerous." "Wouldn't mind riding alongside your wagon to Hawthorne, if you'd allow it." Sarah hesitated. She'd learned to be wary of strangers offering help, especially men. But there was something straightforward about Dustin Young that put her at ease, and the practical reality was that if the wheel came off again, she'd be in trouble. "I suppose that would be sensible," she finally agreed. "I've got coffee in my supplies if you'd care for some before we set off." "That's the best offer I've had all week," Dustin said with a genuine smile. As Sarah built a small fire and prepared the coffee, Dustin tended to his horse, a handsome chestnut gelding. The rhythm of their tasks filled the silence comfortably. "You from around these parts?" Sarah asked as she handed him a steaming cup. "Not originally," Dustin replied, gratefully accepting the coffee. "Grew up in Missouri, came west after the war." Sarah nodded, understanding what went unsaid. Many men had headed west after the Civil War, seeking to leave memories behind and find new beginnings. "Been working cattle mostly," he continued. "Just finished a drive up north, heading to Hawthorne myself to see about a ranch hand position at the Double R." "The Rosewood Ranch?" Sarah asked. "That's only about 5 miles from my place." Small world, Dustin remarked with a hint of a smile. You've been in Hawthorne long. 2 years, Sarah said, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. Came from St. Louis, wanted. She paused, wanted something different. Dustin nodded, not pressing for more. They finished their coffee in companionable silence before packing up to continue the journey. The afternoon sun was relentless as they traveled, Dustin riding alongside Sarah's wagon. He noticed how competently she handled the team of horses, her slender hands firm on the reins. You didn't learn to drive a wagon like that in the city, he observed. Sarah smiled slightly. My father had a freight business in Missouri before we moved to St. Louis. I spent more time with the drivers than my mother thought proper. Lucky for you now, Dustin said. Yes, Sarah agreed, her expression softening momentarily. He taught me a lot of useful things before he died. The miles passed slowly under the hot sun. Dustin occasionally rode ahead to check the trail, returning to ride alongside the wagon. They talked sporadically about the weather, about Hawthorne, about horses' safe topics that revealed little yet somehow built a tentative connection between them. As dusk approached, Sarah pulled the wagon to a stop beside a small stream. We should make camp, she said. We're still a good 4 hours from Hawthorne, and I don't want to risk the horses in the dark. Dustin nodded in agreement. I'll see to the horses if you'd like to start a fire. They worked efficiently, settling into roles without discussion. While Sarah prepared a simple supper of beans, salt pork, and biscuits, Dustin unsaddled his horse and cared for her team, making sure they were watered and had grain to eat. As they sat by the fire eating their meal, the vast Nevada sky darkened to reveal a spectacular blanket of stars. The night air grew cool, a welcome relief after the heat of the day. Thank you, Sarah said suddenly, for stopping to help. Not everyone would. Dustin looked up from his plate. My mother would have had my hide if I'd ridden past a person in need. Sarah smiled. She sounds like a wise woman. She was, Dustin said softly. Lost her to fever when I was 15. I'm sorry, Sarah replied, recognizing the familiar shadow of grief in his voice. Dustin looked at her across the fire, his expression thoughtful. You said you don't have a husband, but you're wearing a wedding band. Sarah's hand instinctively went to the simple gold ring on her finger. She was quiet for so long that Dustin thought she wouldn't answer. I was married, she finally said, her voice low. His name was Thomas. He died in a mining accident a year after we moved to Hawthorne. I'm sorry for your loss, Dustin said sincerely. Sarah nodded, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. It was hard at first, still is some days. But I've managed to keep our place going. It's not much, just a small homestead with some chickens, a cow, and a vegetable garden, but it's mine. That takes courage, Dustin observed. Staying on alone. Where else would I go? Sarah asked simply. Back east to be a burden on relatives who barely remember me. No, this is my home now. They fell into silence again, but it was comfortable, each lost in their own thoughts as the fire crackled between them. I'll take first watch, Dustin offered as they finished their meal. You get some rest. You don't need to keep watch, Sarah said. I've made this journey alone before. I'm sure you have, Dustin replied. But since I'm here, might as well make myself useful. Sarah wanted to argue but was too exhausted from the day's efforts. She nodded gratefully and retreated to her wagon, where she had a small bedroll arranged on the wooden floor. As she drifted toward sleep, she could hear Dustin moving quietly around the camp, checking on the horses one more time. There was something comforting about his presence, solid and reassuring, like the mountains that defined the horizon. Dustin sat with his back against a wagon wheel, rifle across his knees, watching the darkness beyond their small circle of firelight. It had been a long time since he'd shared a campfire with anyone other than fellow ranch hands. There was something about Sarah Collins that intrigued him, her independence, the quiet strength in her green eyes, and the sadness that lingered just beneath the surface. The night passed peacefully, with Dustin waking Sarah for her watch in the early hours before dawn. When morning came, they shared a quick breakfast before continuing their journey. As the sun climbed higher, Hawthorne came into view in the distance, a collection of wooden buildings nestled in a valley, with mountains rising behind it. The sight of the town seemed to bring both relief and tension to Sarah's posture. "Your homestead is outside of town?" Dustin asked as they drew closer. "Yes, about 2 miles north," Sarah replied. "I'll be fine from here if you want to head straight to the Double R." "I'll see you to your door," Dustin said firmly. "Started this escort, might as well finish it properly." Sarah glanced at him, a small smile playing at her lips. "Are all Missouri men this stubborn?" "Only the ones raised right," Dustin answered with a grin. They passed through Hawthorne, drawing curious glances from the townspeople. Sarah acknowledged a few with nods but didn't stop to talk. Dustin noticed how she sat straighter, her face more guarded now that they were among others. North of town, Sarah guided her wagon onto a narrow dirt track that wound through patches of pine trees. After about 2 miles, they came to a small clearing where a modest cabin stood, with a barn and chicken coop nearby. A vegetable garden, protected by a fence, grew to one side, and a cow grazed in a small pasture. "This is me," Sarah said as she pulled the wagon to a stop. "Thank you for your company, Mr. Young." "Dustin," he corrected her. "And it was my pleasure, Sarah." He helped her unload her supplies, carrying the heavier items into the cabin for her. The interior was simple but homey, with a few touches colorful curtains, a braided rug, wildflowers, and a jar that spoke of Sarah's determination to make this place a home. "If you ever need help with anything," Dustin said as he prepared to leave, "the Double R isn't far." "Assuming they hire me, of course." "They'd be fools not to," Sarah said. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "Good luck, Dustin, and thank you again." He tipped his hat to her, mounted his horse, and rode away. Sarah watched him go, telling herself the sudden emptiness she felt was just tiredness from the journey. The next few weeks passed in a blur of routine for Sarah. She tended her garden, cared for her animals, and made her weekly trips into Hawthorne for supplies and to sell her eggs and vegetables. She heard through town gossip that Dustin Young had indeed been hired at the Double R Ranch and was proving himself a valuable hand. Sarah tried not to think about him, focusing instead on preparing for the coming winter. But sometimes, in the quiet evenings as she sat on her porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, she found herself wondering how he was faring. It was on a crisp September morning that their paths crossed again. Sarah was in Hawthorne, trading her eggs for flour at Whitman's General Store when the door opened and Dustin walked in. He spotted her immediately, his face lighting up with a smile that made something flutter in Sarah's chest. "Sarah Collins," he said, crossing to her. "Good to see you." "Mr. Young," she replied, more formally than she'd intended. "I hear the Double R took you on." "They did," he confirmed. "It's good work with good people." He hesitated, then asked, "How have you been managing? No more trouble with that wagon wheel, I hope?" "None at all," Sarah assured him. "Everything's been running smoothly." Mr. Whitman, the storekeeper, watched their interaction with undisguised interest, prompting Sarah to finish her business quickly. "I should be getting back," she said, gathering her purchases. "Let me help you with those," Dustin offered, taking the heavier sacks before she could protest. Outside, as he loaded the supplies into her wagon, Dustin said, "I've been meaning to ride out to check on you, but Mr. Rosewood's kept us busy with the fall roundup." Sarah was surprised by his admission. "There's no need to check on me. I manage just fine." "I don't doubt it," Dustin said, echoing his words from their first meeting, "but neighbors look out for each other in these parts." "Is that what we are?" Sarah asked. "Neighbors?" Dustin's eyes held hers. "I'd like to think we're at least that." Sarah felt her cheeks warm under his steady gaze. "I suppose we are," she conceded. "Then, as your neighbor," Dustin continued, "I'm inviting you to the harvest dance at the Double R next Saturday. The whole town's coming." "It wouldn't be right if you weren't there." Sarah's immediate instinct was to refuse. She hadn't attended a social gathering since Thomas's death, preferring the solitude of her homestead to the pitying looks and whispered comments of the townsfolk. Dustin seemed to read her hesitation. "Just think about it," he said gently. "It might do you good to enjoy yourself for an evening." Before Sarah could respond, a woman's voice called out, "Sarah Collins, is that you hiding behind all those supplies?" Sarah turned to see Martha Jenkins, the town's most notorious gossip, approaching with determined steps. "Hello, Mrs. Jenkins," Sarah greeted politely. "I haven't seen you at church these past Sundays," the older woman said, her tone making it clear this was a criticism rather than an observation. "I've been busy with the harvest," Sarah explained. Mrs. Jenkins's gaze shifted to Dustin, her eyes sharp with curiosity. "And who might this be?" "Dustin Young, madam," he answered, tipping his hat. "I work at the Double R." "I see, Mrs. Jenkins said, her tone suggesting she saw a great deal more than was actually present. "Well, it's nice to see Sarah making new friends." The way she emphasized the last word made Sarah's spine stiffen. "Mr. Young was just helping me with my supplies," she said firmly. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to be getting back before dark." "Of course, dear," Mrs. Jenkins replied with a thin smile. "Don't forget about the church social next month. We miss seeing you there." As the woman walked away, Sarah could practically feel the gossip taking shape in her wake. She turned to Dustin with a sigh. "That's why I don't come to town more than necessary," she said quietly. Dustin's expression was sympathetic. "People talk. It's what they do when they don't have enough real concerns to fill their days." "It makes things harder," Sarah said, climbing up to her wagon seat. "Being a widow is difficult enough without wagging tongues adding to it." "All the more reason to come to the dance," Dustin suggested. "Show them you're not hiding away, that you're moving forward with your life." Sarah looked down at him, struck by the simple wisdom in his words. "Perhaps you're right," she admitted. "I'll think about it." "That's all I'm asking," Dustin said with a smile. "Take care of yourself, Sarah Collins." As she drove out of town, Sarah found herself genuinely considering Dustin's invitation. It had been so long since she'd allowed herself any kind of enjoyment or social interaction. Thomas wouldn't have wanted her to live like a hermit, she knew that. But stepping back into the world meant opening herself up to both judgment and possibility, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for either. The week passed quickly, with Sarah harvesting the last of her garden vegetables and preserving what she could for winter. The question of the dance lingered in her mind, surfacing whenever she had a moment of quiet. By Saturday morning, she still hadn't decided what to do. She went about her chores mechanically, trying not to think about the celebration happening that evening just a few miles away. But when she found herself taking her best dress out of the trunk where it had been stored since Thomas's funeral, Sarah knew she had made her decision. The sun was beginning to set when Sarah hitched her horses to the wagon. She had bathed in water warmed on the stove, arranged her auburn hair in a simple but elegant style, and put on her blue dress, the only one she owned that wasn't meant for work. Looking in the small mirror above her washstand, she barely recognized herself without the usual dust and weariness of daily labor. The Double R Ranch was lit up with lanterns when Sarah arrived, The large barn cleared out and decorated with autumn leaves and wildflowers. A small band was playing lively tunes, and couples were already dancing while others gathered around tables laden with food. Sarah sat in her wagon for a long moment, her courage faltering. It had been easier to decide to come when she was alone at her cabin. Now, faced with the reality of walking into that barn full of people, she wasn't sure she could do it. Just as she was considering turning around and heading home, a figure appeared beside her wagon. "You came," Dustin said, his voice warm with pleased surprise. Sarah looked down at him, struck by how different he looked cleaned up and in his best clothes. His dark hair was neatly combed and his usually weathered face was freshly shaved. "I almost didn't," she admitted. "But you're here now," Dustin said, offering his hand to help her down. "And I'm mighty glad about that." Sarah hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his and allowing him to assist her from the wagon. His touch was warm and steady, and he didn't let go immediately after she was standing beside him. "You look beautiful, Sarah," he said softly. Sarah felt a blush creeping up her neck. "Thank you," she murmured, unused to compliments after so long alone. Dustin offered his arm. "Shall we?" Taking a deep breath, Sarah placed her hand in the crook of his elbow and allowed him to escort her toward the barn. She could feel eyes turning toward them as they entered, could hear the momentary lull in conversation before it resumed with greater intensity. But with Dustin beside her, the scrutiny seemed less daunting. Mr. Rosewood himself, a tall man with silver hair and a kind face, came to greet them. "Mrs. Collins, what a pleasure to see you here. It's been too long since you've joined us for a celebration." "Thank you for having me, Mr. Rosewood," Sarah replied politely. "Young here is one of my best new hands," Rosewood continued, clapping Dustin on the shoulder. "Got a natural way with cattle and horses. I'm thinking of putting him in charge of breaking the new colts come spring." "That's a big responsibility," Sarah said, glancing at Dustin with genuine admiration. "He's more than up to it," Rosewood assured her before being called away by his wife to greet other guests. "You didn't tell me you were doing so well," Sarah said to Dustin as he led her toward the refreshment table. He shrugged modestly. "It's just work I enjoy and happen to be good at." Sarah accepted a cup of punch, using it as an excuse to gather her thoughts. Being here, among people with Dustin at her side, was stirring feelings she'd thought long buried nervousness, yes, but also a spark of something like happiness. "Would you care to dance?" Dustin asked as the band struck up a waltz. Sarah hesitated. "I haven't danced since. Well, it's been a very long time." "It's like riding a horse," Dustin said with an encouraging smile. "Once you learn, you never really forget." Before she could talk herself out of it, Sarah nodded. "All right, but don't blame me if your toes get trampled." Dustin led her to the dance floor, placing one hand respectfully at her waist while holding her other hand in his. As they began to move to the music, Sarah was surprised to find that he was right. Her body remembered the steps, even if they were a bit hesitant at first. "See, you're a natural," Dustin said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. As they twirled among the other couples, Sarah gradually relaxed, allowing herself to enjoy the moment, the music, the movement, and the solid presence of Dustin guiding her across the floor. For a few precious minutes, she wasn't the widow Collins, an object of pity and gossip. She was just a woman dancing with a handsome man on a beautiful autumn evening. When the music ended, Sarah was flushed and slightly breathless, but smiling a real smile that reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said to Dustin as they made their way to the edge of the dance floor. "That was nice." "It was my pleasure," Dustin replied, his eyes warm as they met hers. The evening continued pleasantly. with Sarah even engaging in conversation with some of the ranch wives and townspeople she'd avoided for so long. Not everyone was welcoming Mrs. Jenkins and her circle watched with disapproving eyes as Sarah danced again with Dustin, but for the most part, people seemed genuinely pleased to see her participating in community life once more. As the hour grew late, Dustin noticed Sarah stifling a yawn. "Let me see you home," he offered. "It's been a long evening." Sarah was too tired to argue. The emotional exertion of the night had taken as much out of her as a day of physical labor. They rode in companionable silence, Sarah in her wagon with Dustin on horseback beside her. The moon lit their way, casting the landscape in silver light and deep shadow. "I'm glad you came tonight," Dustin said as they neared her homestead. "So am I," Sarah admitted. "It's been a long time since I enjoyed myself like that." When they reached her cabin, Dustin helped her unhitch the horses and stable them for the night. At her door, they stood awkwardly for a moment, neither quite ready to say goodbye. "Would it be all right if I called on you sometime?" Dustin asked finally. "Perhaps next Sunday after church." Sarah looked up at him, his face half shadowed in the moonlight. "I'd like that," she said softly. Dustin smiled, tipped his hat, and turned to go. Sarah watched him mount his horse and ride away, a strange mixture of emotions swirling inside her. There was fear, certainly fear of opening her heart again, of inviting pain back into her life. But there was also a flicker of hope, a sensation so unfamiliar she almost didn't recognize it. As she got ready for bed, Sarah caught sight of her wedding ring gleaming in the lamplight. For the first time since Thomas's death, she wondered if there might come a day when she would be ready to remove it. True to his word, Dustin came calling the following Sunday. He arrived in the early afternoon, riding a different horse than before, a spirited black mare that pranced eagerly as they approached. Sarah had spent the morning in an unusual state of nervous anticipation, baking bread and apple pie, tidying the already neat cabin, and changing her dress twice, before settling on a simple green one that Thomas had once said matched her eyes. When she heard hoofbeats, she forced herself to wait inside rather than rushing out to greet him. Only when Dustin knocked on the door did she open it, trying to appear as though she hadn't been watching through the window. "Afternoon, Sarah," he said, hat in hand. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything." "Not at all," she assured him, stepping back to invite him in. "I just finished baking, actually. Would you care for some pie?" "I wouldn't say no to that," Dustin replied with a smile. As Sarah served the pie and coffee, she noticed Dustin looking around her cabin with interest. It was a simple place, one main room with a small bedroom partitioned off, but she had made it comfortable with the limited resources at her disposal. "Did you build this place yourself?" Dustin asked. Sarah shook her head. "Thomas did, with help from some men in town. That was before the accident." She hesitated, then added, "He was a carpenter by trade. Came west to work the mines, but he built this place to remind him of what he really loved doing." Dustin nodded, understanding in his eyes. "He did fine work. It's solid." "Yes," Sarah agreed softly. "It is." They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes before Dustin said, "I've been meaning to ask, how do you manage all the work around here by yourself? It's a lot for one person." "I do what needs doing," Sarah answered simply. "Some things I've learned to do without, and others I trade for. Mr. Peterson from the next homestead over helps with the heavy plowing in exchange for preserves and mending." "And you're happy here?" Dustin asked, his gaze direct. The question caught Sarah off guard. No one had asked about her happiness in a very long time. Most people in town seemed to assume that happiness was no longer relevant to her life as a widow. "I'm content," she said finally. "It's my home." Dustin seemed to consider this, his expression thoughtful. "Contentment's nothing to scoff at," he acknowledged, "but it's not the same as happiness." Sarah set down her coffee cup, a flicker of irritation passing through her. "And what would you know about it, Mr. Young, about losing someone and having to find a way to go on?" Instead of taking offense, Dustin's expression softened with compassion. "More than you might think," he said quietly. "I was married once too." Sarah's irritation dissolved instantly. "You were," Dustin nodded, his eyes distant with memory. "Her name was Elizabeth. We were childhood sweethearts in Missouri. Married just before I went off to fight in '63. She died of typhoid while I was away at war. Never even got to say goodbye." "I'm so sorry," Sarah whispered, understanding now the shadow she'd occasionally glimpsed in his eyes, the same one she saw in her own mirror. "It was a long time ago," Dustin said. "But it changes you, losing someone like that. Makes you cautious about letting yourself care too deeply again." Sarah nodded, words failing her in the face of this unexpected connection between them. "That's why I recognized it in you," Dustin continued gently. "That careful distance you keep, even when you're being friendly. I've been living with it myself for years. Does it ever go away?" Sarah asked, her voice barely audible. "The grief?" Dustin shook his head. "Not entirely, but it changes shape, becomes something you can carry without it crushing you." They sat in silence for a moment, the shared understanding between them more profound than any words could express. "Would you like to see the rest of the place?" Sarah offered eventually, needing to move to break the intensity of the moment. Dustin nodded, and they spent the rest of the afternoon walking the boundaries of her small homestead. He admired her vegetable garden, praised the condition of her chickens and cow, and offered practical suggestions for repairs the barn would need before winter. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant orange and pink, they stood by the corral where Dustin's mare grazed contentedly beside Sarah's plow horses. "I should be getting back," Dustin said reluctantly. "Yes, it'll be dark soon," Sarah agreed, equally reluctant to see the day end. "Would it be all right if I came again next Sunday?" he asked. Sarah smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her. "I'd like that very much." And so began a pattern that carried them through the autumn months. Every Sunday, Dustin would ride out to Sarah's homestead. Sometimes they worked together on projects repairing fence posts, patching the barn roof, preparing the garden for winter. Other times they simply talked, sharing stories of their lives before and their hopes for the future. Gradually, Sarah found herself looking forward to Sundays with an anticipation that bordered on eagerness. She began to notice little things about Dustin, the way one corner of his mouth lifted higher than the other when he smiled, the gentle way he handled animals, the careful respect with which he treated her boundaries. November brought the first snow, a light dusting that melted by midday but served as a warning of the winter to come. On one particularly cold Sunday, they sat by Sarah's fireplace, a comfortable silence between them as Dustin whittled a piece of wood and Sarah mended a shirt. "What are you making?" she asked, noticing how the wood was taking shape under his skilled hands. Dustin held it up for her to see a small, delicately carved horse. "Just passing the time," he said modestly. "My grandfather taught me when I was a boy." "It's beautiful," Sarah said, genuinely impressed. "You're quite talented." "It's relaxing," Dustin said with a shrug. "Helps me think." "And what are you thinking about?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Dustin looked up, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "About how much I've come to care for you, Sarah Collins." Sarah's hand stilled on her mending, her heart beating faster. "Dustin, you don't need to say anything," he said quickly. "I know it might be too soon. I just wanted you to know." Sarah set aside her sewing, her thoughts racing. In the months since they'd met, Dustin had become important to her in a way she hadn't believed possible after Thomas, but admitting that felt like a betrayal of her husband's memory. "I care for you too," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm not sure I'm ready for what that might mean." Dustin nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, Sarah. I just want to be part of your life in whatever way feels right to you." "You already are," she assured him, reaching out impulsively to touch his hand. The contact, brief as it was, sent a current of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the fire crackling in the hearth. As winter settled over the Nevada landscape, blanketing the ground with snow and sending temperatures plummeting, Sarah found herself grateful for Dustin's presence in her life in practical ways as well as emotional ones. He helped ensure her homestead was prepared for the harsh weather, chopping extra firewood, insulating her windows and doors, and checking that her barn was secure for the animals. The Sunday visits continued, though sometimes weather made them impossible. On those Sundays when the snow was too deep or the wind too fierce, Sarah felt his absence keenly, the hours dragging until evening came and she could reasonably go to bed. It was during one such blizzard in early January that Sarah heard a pounding on her door. Concerned and curious, she wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and opened it to find Dustin, snow-covered and shivering. "Dustin," she gasped, pulling him inside. "What on earth are you doing out in this storm?" "Checking on you," he said through chattering teeth. "Haven't been able to get out here in 2 weeks. Was worried your supplies might be running low." Sarah hurried to stoke the fire, motioning for him to come closer to its warmth. "You could have frozen to death," she scolded, though her heart swelled at his concern. "Worth the risk," Dustin said, stamping his feet to restore circulation. "Brought you some flour and coffee, and these." From inside his coat, he produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. Sarah unwrapped it to find chocolate candies, a rare luxury in Hawthorne, especially in winter. "How did you?" she began, touched by the thoughtful gift. "Mr. Rosewood went to Carson City last week. Asked him to pick them up," Dustin explained, his color returning as he warmed up. "Thank you," Sarah said softly. "But please don't risk yourself like this again. I have plenty of supplies." Dustin's expression grew serious. "I couldn't bear the thought of you being in need and me not knowing." The simple honesty in his voice moved Sarah deeply. Before she could respond, a particularly violent gust of wind rattled the windows. "You can't go back in this," she said firmly. "It's getting worse." Dustin glanced toward the window where snow was piling against the glass. "I don't want to impose." "It's not an imposition," Sarah assured him. "It would be madness to try to ride back to the Double R tonight." And so Dustin stayed, sleeping on a pallet by the fire while Sarah retreated to her small bedroom. Though a wall separated them, Sarah was acutely aware of his presence in her home, the sound of his breathing, the occasional creak of floorboards as he shifted position. In the morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine white landscape and a sky of brilliant blue. They shared a simple breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, an unexpectedly domestic scene that felt both strange and right. "I should get back," Dustin said reluctantly. "Mr. Rosewood will be wondering where I am." Sarah nodded, walking with him to the barn to help saddle his horse. As they worked, their hands occasionally brushed, each contact sending that now familiar warmth through her. "Thank you for your hospitality," Dustin said as he prepared to leave. "And for not letting me freeze to death out there." Sarah smiled. "Thank you for caring enough to check on me." Dustin mounted his horse, looking down at her with an expression that made her heart skip. For a moment, she thought he might lean down to kiss her and found herself both hoping for it and fearing it. Instead, he tipped his hat. "I'll see you Sunday, weather permitting." As Sarah watched him ride away, she realized something had shifted between them during the night. The careful distance they'd maintained was narrowing, and the prospect was as exciting as it was terrifying. The following Sunday dawned clear and cold. Sarah spent the morning preparing a special meal venison stew with dumplings, fresh bread, and an apple pie. She told herself it was just to thank Dustin for his kindness during the blizzard, but in her heart, she knew it was more when he arrived, his face lit up at the scent of cooking food that greeted him. "Smells like heaven in here," he said appreciatively. "Just a proper thank you for the supplies," Sarah explained, feeling suddenly shy. They ate at her small table, talking easily about happenings at the Double R and in town. Dustin mentioned that Mr. Rosewood was considering making him foreman come spring, a position that would mean more responsibility but also better pay and a cabin of his own on the ranch property. "That's wonderful news," Sarah said sincerely. "You've earned it." "It would mean staying in Hawthorne permanently," Dustin said, his eyes searching hers. "Putting down roots." The implication hung in the air between them, unspoken but clear. After the meal, they sat by the fire, the comfortable silence they'd grown accustomed to wrapping around them like a blanket. Sarah was painfully aware of how close Dustin sat, of the way the firelight played across his features. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Dustin said finally, breaking the silence, "about what you said a few months back about not being sure if you were ready." Sarah's heart began to race. "Yes. I want you to know that I understand what it means to love someone and lose them," Dustin continued carefully. "I know that loving again doesn't mean forgetting. Thomas will always be part of who you are, just as Elizabeth is part of me." Tears pricked at Sarah's eyes, not of sadness, but of profound gratitude for his understanding. "I'm not asking you to forget him," Dustin said softly. "I'm just asking for a chance to build something new alongside those memories." Sarah looked down at her hands, at the wedding band that still circled her finger. Slowly, deliberately, she twisted it free and placed it on the small table beside her chair. "I think I'm ready to try," she whispered. The joy that bloomed on Dustin's face was like sunrise after a long night. He reached for her hand, entwining his fingers with hers. "May I kiss you, Sarah Collins?" he asked, his voice husky with emotion. In answer, Sarah leaned forward, closing the distance between them. His lips met hers gently at first, then with growing confidence as she responded. It was a kiss of promise, of new beginnings, and when they finally drew apart, Sarah felt as though something long frozen inside her had begun to thaw. "I don't want to rush you," Dustin said, his forehead resting against hers. "We have time," Sarah assured him, her heart fuller than it had been in years. As winter gave way to spring, Sarah and Dustin's relationship deepened and blossomed like the wildflowers that began to dot the Nevada landscape. His Sunday visits became more frequent, sometimes extending to Saturday as well. They worked side by side on her homestead, rode together exploring the countryside, and gradually became a recognized couple in Hawthorne. There was gossip. Of course there always was in small towns, but Sarah found she cared less about it than she'd expected. The happiness she'd found with Dustin was worth a few wagging tongues. In early April, Dustin was officially made foreman of the Double R, moving into the small cabin that came with the position. The promotion came with another change, more responsibility that sometimes kept him from visiting as regularly as before. "I miss seeing you," he told Sarah one evening as they sat on her porch, watching the sunset. "Living at the Double R but spending all my free time here, it feels like I'm stretched between two places." Sarah nodded, understanding his frustration. She'd been feeling it too, the constant partings growing more difficult each time. "I've been thinking," Dustin continued, taking her hand in his. "About a more permanent solution." Sarah's breath caught. "What kind of solution?" Dustin turned to face her fully, his expression serious yet tender. "I love you, Sarah. I think I've loved you since that first day when I saw you struggling with that wagon wheel, too stubborn to ask for help but too determined to give up." Sarah smiled, remembering. "I wasn't very gracious about accepting your assistance." "You were perfect," Dustin said, squeezing her hand. "Strong, independent, beautiful. Everything I didn't know I was looking for." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. Opening it, he revealed a simple but lovely ring, a small sapphire set in silver. "Sarah Collins, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Dustin asked, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I promise to cherish you, to respect your strength and independence, and to build a life with you filled with as much happiness as possible." Sarah looked at the ring, then at Dustin, her heart overflowing. The doubts and fears that had held her back for so long seemed to fall away in the face of his love and the future he was offering. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and certain. "Yes, I will marry you, Dustin Young." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger, where her wedding band from Thomas had once been. The weight of it felt different, not a reminder of loss, but a promise of what was to come. Their kiss sealed the promise, passionate and full of hope for the future they would build together. The news of their engagement spread quickly through Hawthorne. Most offered congratulations, genuinely pleased to see Sarah finding happiness again. A few, like Mrs. Jenkins, made thinly veiled comments about the proper length of time for mourning, but Sarah found she could smile and walk away, secure in the knowledge that what she and Dustin shared was right and true. They decided on a June wedding, simple and small, with just friends from town and the double R. Sarah would continue living at her homestead, which was close enough to the ranch that Dustin could easily divide his time between his duties as foreman and his life with Sarah. As the wedding day approached, Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and occasional pangs of bittersweet memory. One evening, as she was sorting through her belongings, she came across a small portrait of Thomas. Looking at his smiling face, she felt not guilt but a gentle sadness mixed with gratitude for the time they'd had together. "I think you would like him," she said softly to the image. "He's a good man, Thomas, different from you but good in his own way. I'll always love you, but my heart has room enough for this new love too." Setting the portrait carefully in a keepsake box along with her first wedding ring, Sarah felt a sense of peace settle over her. The past and future weren't in conflict. They were parts of the same journey, her journey. The wedding day dawned clear and warm, the kind of perfect June day that seemed created for celebrations. Sarah wore a new dress of pale blue, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Dustin, looking handsome and slightly nervous in his best suit, waited for her beside the minister in front of their gathered friends. As Sarah walked toward him, alone but steady in her purpose, she saw in Dustin's eyes a reflection of her own joy and certainty. This was right. This was where she was meant to be. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, their vows simple but heartfelt. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheer that went up from their friends seemed to echo the happiness bursting in Sarah's heart. The celebration afterward was lively, with music and dancing lasting well into the evening. As Sarah and Dustin danced together, now as husband and wife, she couldn't help but remember that first dance at the harvest festival that had begun to break down her walls. "Happy?" Dustin asked softly, his arms secure around her. "More than I thought possible," Sarah answered truthfully. Later, when the guests had gone and they were alone in their cabin, the reality of the change in their relationship brought a moment of shy awkwardness. But Dustin, gentle and patient as always, followed Sarah's lead, allowing her to set the pace of their newfound intimacy. In the tender darkness of their wedding night, Sarah discovered that love could indeed bloom twice in one lifetime, different but equally precious. The months that followed were a time of adjustment and deepening connection. They settled into a rhythm of life together, balancing Dustin's responsibilities at the double R with the needs of Sarah's homestead. It wasn't always easy. They had occasional disagreements, as any couple does, but they faced each challenge together, growing stronger for it. By the time winter returned, Sarah had another secret to share with Dustin. One evening, as they sat by the fire after dinner, she took his hand and placed it gently on her still flat stomach. "I have something to tell you," she said, a smile playing at her lips. Dustin's eyes widened in understanding, joy dawning on his face. "Are you?" Sarah nodded. "The baby should come in early summer." Dustin gathered her into his arms, his embrace gentle as though she were made of glass. "A baby," he whispered, awe in his voice. "Our baby." The winter passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Dustin built a cradle with the same care he'd shown in carving that small horse the year before. Sarah sewed tiny clothes and blankets in the evenings, her heart full of dreams for the child growing within her. Spring brought new life to the land, and increasing evidence of the new life Sarah carried. Her body changed, rounding with the promise of their child, and Dustin watched the transformation with a mixture of pride and protective concern. "You're working too hard," he would often say, trying to take over her chores. "I'm pregnant, not ill," Sarah would respond, though she did allow him to handle the heavier tasks as her pregnancy progressed. In late June, just over a year after their wedding, Sarah went into labor. Dustin rode frantically to fetch the midwife from town, returning to pace anxiously outside their bedroom door as the hours passed. Inside, Sarah worked through the pain with the same determination she'd shown in facing all of life's challenges. Finally, as the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, a new cry joined the chorus of morning birds. Dustin rushed in at the midwife's call to find Sarah, exhausted but radiant, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in one of the blankets she'd sewn. "You have a son," she said, her voice thick with emotion as she placed the baby in Dustin's arms. Looking down at the small, red face of his son, Dustin felt a love so overwhelming it brought tears to his eyes. "He's perfect," he whispered, "just like his mother." They named him David Thomas Young, honoring both Dustin's father and Sarah's first husband. It seemed right to acknowledge the past even as they celebrated this new beginning. Life with a baby brought new challenges and joys. Nights were often broken by David's hungry cries, days filled with the constant demands of an infant alongside their regular work. But there were also moments of pure happiness. David's first smile, the way his tiny hand would curl around Dustin's finger, the peaceful sight of him sleeping in Sarah's arms. As David grew from infant to toddler, Sarah and Dustin's love deepened and matured. The passionate romance of their early days evolved into something equally powerful but more enduring, a partnership built on mutual respect, shared goals, and the daily choice to love one another through all of life's complexities. When David was 2, Sarah gave birth to a daughter they named Elizabeth Rose, a healthy, strong-willed little girl who had Dustin wrapped around her finger from the moment she first looked at him with Sarah's green eyes. The years passed in the rhythm of seasons, each bringing its own joys and sorrows, triumphs and challenges. The children grew, the homestead prospered, and Sarah and Dustin grew older together, their love a constant anchor in the sometimes turbulent sea of life. There were difficult times, a drought that nearly destroyed their crops, An illness that swept through Hawthorne, claiming several lives. The death of Mr. Rosewood that left Dustin suddenly in charge of the entire ranch operations. But through it all, they faced life as they had that first wagon wheel together, combining their strengths to overcome whatever obstacles came their way. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Dustin surprised Sarah with a special gift, the deed to a parcel of land that connected their homestead to the Double R, effectively joining the two properties. "Now I won't have to choose between my two homes," he explained as she examined the document. "And the children will have plenty of room to grow and build their own places someday, if they choose." Sarah looked up at her husband, seeing in his face the same strength and kindness that had first drawn her to him all those years ago on a dusty road outside Hawthorne. There were a few more lines around his eyes now, a touch of silver at his temples, but to her he was more handsome than ever. "Have I told you lately that I love you, Dustin Young?" she asked, setting aside the deed to wrap her arms around him. "Not since this morning," he replied with a grin, pulling her close, "but I never tire of hearing it." As they stood together in the home they'd built with love and hard work, Sarah thought about the long journey that had brought them to this moment, from a broken wagon wheel to a life overflowing with blessings. She thought of the young widow she'd been, convinced that happiness was behind her, and marveled at how wrong she'd been. Life had taught her that the heart's capacity for love wasn't limited, that new beginnings could rise from endings, and that sometimes help comes when and where you least expect it, even in the form of a cowboy stopping to aid a stubborn woman trying to lift a wagon wheel alone. And in that moment, with her husband's arms around her and the sounds of their children playing outside, Sarah Collins Young knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just contentment, but true and lasting happiness.